What's up, guys? Welcome back to Unofficial AR. Here we go again with another tutorial. I skipped 1 week because I've been really working hard on another tutorial that is taking a little longer, but it's gonna be really amazing for you when you get that sample. So just hold on a little bit more. But meantime, I think it was a good time for looking into something that a lot of developers asked me about, and this is the scene manager for Lens Studio. So you might know the scene manager from Unity if you are a Unity developer or you are familiar with Unity. And scene manager in Unity, I feel like is something that is being usually mentioned a lot for collaboration also. For collaboration because maybe you work on a scene, your collaborators work on another scene, then you assemble it together. It's very easy to split the project according to certain models. It's very good practice, right? Also to subdivide your project according scenes and having a core scene, then having an additive scene and so on. So if you're not familiar with what the scene manager is and you want to, this is also a tutorial for you because we're going to go through all of the fundamentals, but mostly this is more of comparison between what the developer might expect and it's available on Lens Studio. Because also Lens Studio, believe it or not, has actually a scene manager, and you can see here in my screen. The scene manager is not at this time is not something like you might find in Unity, but it's really similar. So I think that actually there are some pros and cons. I think more pros overall than cons. Might think initially that is a little bit more of something not too familiar to you, but after a while, after you understand how it works, I'm pretty sure 100% that you will understand the potential of how the scene manager is kind of in the environment of Lens Studio. I also prepared a sample for you to use the scene manager. So this will be something that I will share with this video. If you ever have any, or it's not clear or you cannot set it up, well, I set it up for you. So just use this example that I will zip and I will share it with you. So going back to the documentation, the scene manager is a custom component that simplifies organizing your Lens Studio into distinct scenes. This component provides essential function for scene manager, including loading scenes and unloading scenes. So if you're not familiar with what this means, loading and unloading scenes means that you have basically just a space that is the space of your application, the main space of your application, which is the hierarchy, and you can also like scenes together. For example, you have the first scene is like a menu, the second scene is like your hand menu, the third scene is something you see in front of you, and so there is this sort of like very nice way to subdivide your game or your lens or your application in states. So it's really nice to work with the scene manager. And a lot of people about the fact that when you duplicate this object, which is called scene, and this is a little bit misleading, so that's why I'm making this video. When you duplicate this main object that is called scene, break in the Lens Studio project most of the time, or there is unclarity how to manage the project in that way. Well, here's the thing: you don't need to duplicate this object at all, because this is really not. This is scene, but the concept of scene in Lens Studio is pretty different from the scene in Unity. Understand that better, think of let's forget about scene and just let's think about like a main file that runs your application on device or wherever you're running it. The main file is basically in Lens Studio. The scene here is like sort of like the final file that you will just actually deliver. And in Lens Studio are not really seen in terms of like it doesn't make sense to call them scenes in the sense because multiple of these means running multiple instances of your application on device, which doesn't make sense when you think in those terms. Instead, in Unity, scenes are actually a substructure of the main program that actually is running on the device. So just to thinking in those terms, if it's not clear. So once again, do not duplicate this file. This file is the main file that runs your application. What you want to understand instead, in terms of scene management, is that actually scenes are prefabs. So a scene in Lens Studio is fundamentally an object prefab. If you're not familiar with prefabs are a compounded object that you can just, let's say you have, let's do it real quick. If you're familiar with this, just skip ahead. But let's say that you have a box in here, and then you have a box and you just have it in your scene. If I want to turn it into a prefab, usually what you want to do is something like this. You just drag and drop it into the asset browser, the box turned into a prefab. The box can be deleted, and then you can take advantage of this prefab. The prefab can be like scripts, and this is an instance of that specific object that can be instantiated around. So usually used by instantiating multiple objects that's the same object with some variation. So you can use it again. You don't need this anymore in your scene. You don't need it there. You don't need there. You just can reference it directly in your inspector here. So this is what a prefab is. The reason why Lens Studio for now is with the scene management that uses prefabs is because we cannot actually have a double nested prefab in Lens Studio. There is not the concept of nesting a prefab into a prefab, which is something instead, if you have a Unity background, it's probably a very common practice. The fact that you cannot do that, you just need to have one level of management of your scene, basically. Meaning that whenever I open this scene, you will see that there are not longer prefabs inside of these prefabs. If you try to drop a prefab inside of another prefab, the prefab that you drag into the prefab will open, so will no longer be a prefab. So very important to something that might be not too clear at first when you start to use Lens Studio. What can we do? We can actually go around it and just use something called Scene Manager and just think in terms of structuring our scene, this kind of sub-prefab scene. Once again, the lingo becomes quite confusing, so let's recap these concepts. The main difference between Unity and Lens Studio is that Lens Studio has one only scene, which is just like the program that runs on your device. Meanwhile, Unity scenes can be multiple because that's not actually the file that just finally runs and just compile everything on your device. This is not a very good description, but you get the idea. So let's see what's possible here. So what I do in here, you can import the scene manager for the asset from the asset library. So you want to do something like this. You want to go on the asset library and then just get scene manager. You find it here. And whenever you import it in your project, you're just going to find it here as a package. Then you can just drag and drop it directly into the scene. And then you have this nice script, which is set up for you and allows you to reference it through this scene manager. And then you can access to all of these calls. So let me give you an understanding of what's going on here from a scripting point of view. The thing about this is that the code is really similar to Unity in terms of like unloading. This is my script, and you will see that there are some reference here in the beginning. And then let's go forward and just see what actually we care about. We are setting up the buttons, that's okay. And then we have loading the scene asynchronously, so using load additively settings. And then we have load scene additive, which is basically on top of the previous scene. And then we have unload all the scenes. We have check one scenes to see if it's loaded or not, or the states of the scene. We have register a new scene programmatically. We are not using it for now. And then we're just like current scene info. So this is super straightforward. It is part of this example. And you can just see it here. So here I'm loading the scene 0, 0. Here I'm loading the scene 1. And the hook is basically an event that happens when you're loaded the scene. So you can just basically add an event on load. Scene 2, and then we're loading everything. Loading scene 0, we're checking the scene. Scene 0 is loaded, and then we can get some info. This is the hook. So the hook is just an animation that basically is just triggered when you are scene. So very straightforward, very similar to Unity. Once again, depends how you see these things. Limitation, is it really a limitation? Let's talk about this for a second. The limitation is that you cannot nest prefab at this time. But for me, the advantage of this way of thinking is that a scene is basically a prefab. And this initially could be a little bit mind-bending for you, but also makes you understand that you don't need to define so much difference between these two entities if basically you don't even need the scene, right? So let's pretend that this file is just hidden. This is just whatever we have in our hierarchy. And we can just have our scene structured in this way. So we can just do our own thing here and just have scene 0, scene 1, and scene 2. Usually it's good practice. Also, we get this for free. So it's good practice in the scene management in Unity to have a scene that has all of the core logic that persists across other scenes. So it's like the persistent scene. Basically, in this case, it's just this object that I have already in the hierarchy. So in a way, it's actually simplified because there is no need to say do not load it. There is not like kind of that anxiety to say, oh, I loaded a scene in additively or not additively, or is it gonna just, are they gonna, you always need to have one scene in Unity. That's the thing, like not have 0 scene, because actually when you're building your application in Unity, it asks you building panel, like how many scenes you want to build. Actually, a very common error I was doing as a Unity developer, and I'm sure still I would do it, is that I was creating a new scene because the old scene was just like experimentation. Then when I was building, I was actually checkboxing the new scene. So I was building actually the previous scene and I wouldn't see any progress on the device, and I'm like, what am I doing wrong? And then I realized actually that I just checked the wrong scene. So that's not gonna happen here, because when you're building, there is one scene, but you can have this kind of very light way to manage all of your scenes that are basically just prefabs. So here we have an example for you, and the code is very straightforward, as you saw before. Like, I don't think there is any need to go through how it works. It's very straightforward. You can see that there is, for example, let's go in loading scene is a part of it, which gives you a little bit of options. So how to load your scene, you get a little bit of parameters, and then you call the scene manager that we referenced at the beginning. And then when you call the scene manager, you just like call load scene async, and you give it like 2 parameters, which are your options that you just previously set in here. And then you give it the name, the string of the scene. So that's it. And notice that like you're referencing the scene, like you're not referencing the scene here. So it's basically just importing a manager. It's just importing like a global variable way to do things in your project. If you need it, if you can do everything in one scene and you can just like off and on objects, good for you. But this is just a way to kind of things a little bit more clean, and then eventually you can only focus on modifying just like one prefab at a time. Or if it's not easy for you just to modify in this way, what you can do is just like here and then unpack your scene and then modify the scene with all of these objects that are part that you need those objects like spectacle, interaction kit, lighting, and camera to use the scene, and then you pack it again and then you drag and drop it again in the scene here. You know how the scene manager works. You know the difference between the scene manager in Unity and Lens Studio. If you want to give it a try and just structure your project in a more like advanced way, just give it a try. The zip is going to be in the description below. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.